November 1975. Babe Paley is 60 years old. She is dying of lung cancer, and the most famous writer in America has just published a story in Esquire magazine that every person she knows will read before the weekend is out. She didn't need to read far to understand what had happened. The story was called La Côte Basque, 1965. Côte Basque, the French restaurant on East 55th Street in Midtown Manhattan, and it was structured as a gossip-drenched lunch between two women with too much wine and not enough discretion. The characters were thinly veiled. Some were so thin the veil was decorative. And buried inside this piece of fiction was a scene drawn unmistakably from a secret Babe Paley had shared with exactly one person on Earth. A story about her husband, the founder of CBS, scrubbing a blood-stained bedsheet in a frantic panic before his wife came home, trying to erase the evidence of an affair. She had told that story to Truman Capote, no one else. And now Manhattan was reading it over breakfast. She didn't call him. She didn't write him. She didn't send a message through friends. Babe Paley severed Truman Capote from her life that month as cleanly and completely as a surgeon removing tissue that has gone bad. She was a dying woman, and she chose to spend what time she had left without him in it. She would die on July 6, 1978, at age 63, in her New York City apartment. She never spoke to him again. This is the end of the story. Worth knowing from the beginning, because everything that came before it, every choice she made, every compromise she swallowed, every performance she perfected, runs directly toward that silence. To understand why the betrayal destroyed her the way it did, you have to understand what she had built her entire life out of. And to understand that, you have to start with a girl named Barbara Cushing, and a mother who had a plan so deliberate, it looked almost like love. Harvey Williams Cushing was one of the most celebrated neurosurgeons of his era. He held professorships at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and Yale, and he transformed the field of brain surgery at a time when most patients who went under for that kind of procedure didn't come out. He was brilliant and famous and revered. His daughters, Betsy, Minnie, and Barbara, the youngest, born July 5, 1915, in Boston, Massachusetts, were raised understanding that their father's greatness was an inheritance, not a guarantee. The Cushing name was distinguished. The Cushing bank account wasn't. Their mother, Catherine Cushing, known within the family as Gogsy, had a single paramount ambition for all three: see them successfully married into wealthy families. This wasn't a vague parental hope. It was a project, prosecuted with patience and precision across 2 decades. Gogsy studied the social landscape the way a general studies terrain. Who had money and needed class? Who had class and needed youth? Which families were positioned to benefit from an alliance with a famous neurosurgeon's daughters? She moved the girls through the correct rooms, introduced them to the correct people, and prepared them to be chosen by the correct men. The results speak plainly enough. Betsy married James Roosevelt, FDR's eldest son, and later Jock Whitney, newspaper publisher, former ambassador to Britain, and one of the wealthiest men in New York. Minnie married Vincent Astor, 3 sisters. Collectively, they married a Roosevelt, a Whitney, an Astor, and eventually a Paley. Contemporaries who admired and mildly resented the Cushings in equal measure described the sisters as the product of their mother's engineering rather than their father's legacy. They were called the fabulous Cushing sisters. The word fabulous does a lot of work in that sentence. Barbara was the youngest, and by every account, the most beautiful. Her society debut came at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston in October 1934, age 19. The formal presentation of a finished product to its intended market. By the late 1930s, she was in New York, working as a fashion editor at Vogue. One of her contemporaries noted she had been hired because she was photogenic, a politely brutal way of saying that her primary value at Vogue was aesthetic rather than editorial. She wasn't hired to think. She was hired to be looked at. And she was good at being looked at. And she understood the distinction without apparently needing anyone to spell it out. She was also, underneath the studied composure, genuinely talented at a different kind of work. The work of presentation. The dinner parties she would eventually host. The homes she would eventually curate. The particular combination of effortlessness and precision she would eventually achieve in her dress and manner. These were real skills, developed seriously, practiced the way a musician practices scales. By 1941, Time magazine had named her the world's second best-dressed woman, behind only Wallace Simpson, who had caused an abdication crisis partly in service of her wardrobe. In the social ecosystem of mid-century New York, that ranking was a concrete credential. Babe was 26. She married her first husband, Stanley Grafton Mortimer, Jr., in 1940 at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in East Hampton. Mortimer was an oil heir, his lineage traceable to John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, exactly the kind of provenance Gogsey had been assembling toward. They had 2 children, Stanley III and Amanda. The marriage lasted 6 years. Mortimer served in the Navy during the Second World War and came back changed in ways that couldn't be managed by good taste or gracious behavior. He became an alcoholic, developed severe mood swings, was later diagnosed with manic depression. The marriage ended in divorce in 1946. Babe was 31, newly single, living with 2 children and her mother, her first carefully selected husband having come apart in her hands through no fault of her selection process. What the Mortimer collapse taught her, or confirmed more precisely, was that her mother's framework was structurally sound, but had been applied to a man of insufficient power. Mortimer had the right name and the right family. He didn't have the kind of institutional authority that made a man difficult to leave and difficult to undermine. The lesson was about scale. She needed a more powerful man. She found William S. Paley in 1946. He was already estranged from his first wife. His divorce was finalized July 24, 1947. 4 days later, on July 28, 1947, Babe married him. William Samuel Paley was born in 1901 and had built the Columbia Broadcasting System into one of the most powerful institutions in American media. His CBS holdings were worth $9.8 million in 1946. His personal income that year exceeded $800,000. He wasn't merely wealthy in the way that old money families were wealthy. He was actively, expansively powerful, the kind of man whose phone calls got returned by senators, whose name opened rooms that didn't technically have doors. Sally Bedell Smith, whose biography, in all his glory, is the authoritative treatment of his life, describes him in terms that aren't ambiguous. Cruel, insecure, petulant, greedy, a hypochondriac, a scene stealer, and a womanizer. Irene Selznick, theater producer and longtime Paley family friend, put it more concisely. He always had, she said, a roving eye and a groping hand. His first marriage, to Dorothy Hart Hearst, collapsed largely because of his serial pursuit of other women through the early 1940s. This wasn't a late-life development. It was a structural feature of who he was, present from the beginning, and apparently immune to the inconvenience of being married. At the same time, what Bill Paley gave Babe was genuinely formidable, and she knew it when she accepted it. Financial abundance she couldn't have secured any other way. Social elevation so complete that it made her previous social world look provincial. The Paleys lived at the St. Regis Hotel in New York when in the city. They maintained multiple other residences, including an estate on Long Island that became something of a salon. the specific site where, a few years later, Truman Capote would be most thoroughly at home. They hosted dinners that were studied by hostesses across the city the way students study a masterclass. One contemporary account describes the operation of a Paley dinner party in terms that suggest military precision. The flowers, sourced to a specific seasonal specification. The wines, chosen with the sort of attention that made guests feel as though they were witnessing an act of connoisseurship rather than hospitality. Babe was capable of ordering couture by the armful. From one designer alone, she ordered 10 caftans in different colors simultaneously. The Tatler would later describe her as the most beautiful woman of the 20th century. She was, by every account, the standard against which other women measured their own presentations. The exchange at the center of the marriage was explicit enough that multiple biographers and contemporaries stated it openly without embarrassment. Bill gave her financial security and intellectual clout. She gave him a kind of all-American WASP legitimacy he craved and couldn't purchase on his own terms. His Jewish background placed certain old money establishments outside his unassisted reach, and Babe was the credential that opened them. One source puts it directly. He gave her everything material. She gave him a kind of all-American class and entry to a stratum of society he needed. What neither of them publicly acknowledged was the cost structure on Babe's side of that ledger. She had been raised, literally conditioned, by her mother's example and by the culture of her upbringing, to suppress her feelings, maintain composure, and never say anything negative about her husband. One source describes her as groomed to serve a man without complaint. She deployed that conditioning daily. The dinner parties were perfect. The homes were impeccable. The social occasions she presided over were, to every observer, flawlessly managed. Underneath that management, she kept a gold notebook tracking her own perceived flaws. A woman consistently ranked among the most elegant in the world, whose homes were studied and replicated and written about in magazines, who could walk into any room in New York and cause a perceptible shift in temperature. This woman maintained a private inventory of her own inadequacies. The performance wasn't a disguise laid over a serene interior. The performance was holding together something that was fracturing underneath, and the gold notebook was the evidence that she knew it. Bill's affairs weren't discreet. Contemporaries knew. Babe knew. She managed the knowledge the way you manage a slow structural problem in a house you've decided not to sell, by preventing it from becoming visible to guests. The specifics she kept entirely private, shared with no one. By her own later account, she and Bill had not had intimate relations for years, and eventually for an entire decade. She had, during the 1960s, brief affairs of her own, with an American ambassador and with a banker, both of which she ended not because they concluded naturally, but because she was afraid of what Bill would do if he found out. She had no independent financial resources, 4 children, and a social identity constructed entirely within the architecture of the Paley marriage. The bars of the cage were financial and cultural, and deeply internalized, and she understood this. She had chosen it. But choosing a cage doesn't make it stop being a cage. What she needed, and what the marriage couldn't provide, was a single person who would hear the unvarnished version of her life without requiring her to perform anything. A person who wasn't competing for power or position, who had no leverage to exercise, who would simply be present for what was actually true. That person arrived around 1955, and his name was Truman Capote. Capote was, by the mid-1950s, the most famous writer in America. Not necessarily the most technically respected, but the most visible, the most discussed, the most likely to occupy the center of any room he entered. He was small, physically unimposing, flamboyantly theatrical in his speech and manner, and absolutely devastating in conversation. He had published Other Voices, Other Rooms, and The Grass Harp before he was 30, and had moved through New York's social world with a confidence that ignored the usual gatekeeping. He was brilliant, he was entertaining, and he was gay in an era when gay men who navigated wealthy heterosexual social circles occupied a specific and peculiar position. Welcomed into the most guarded rooms because they were presumed to have no competing agenda. They weren't after the husbands. They weren't competing for status in the same financial register. They could be trusted with intimacy in ways that other men couldn't, because the usual currencies of threat didn't apply. The women who gathered around Capote trusted him the way women in that world genuinely couldn't afford to trust most men. He wasn't a rival for their marriages. He wasn't a threat to their social position. He was a confessor, an entertainer. The one figure in their social ecosystem who was fully present for the interior life rather than the performance of it. He had, multiple accounts agree, an uncanny ability to coax people to confide. He listened, actually listened, with that rare quality of complete attention that makes the person being heard feel, for the duration of the conversation, like the most interesting person in the world. The most widely cited account of their meeting places it in January 1955, a trip to Jamaica on the Paleys' private plane, the introduction made through mutual friends David O. Selznick and the actress Jennifer Jones. Jennifer Jones later recalled the moment with a precision that suggests she understood, even then, that she was watching something begin. Babe looked at him, Truman looked at her, and they fell instantly in love. Within months, Capote was a fixture in the Paley world. Weekends at the Long Island estate, evenings at the St. Regis, dinners, travel, the full apparatus of intimacy that wealthy social life provides for people who choose to use it that way. What developed between them over the following 2 decades was genuinely unusual. Not a friendship in the casual sense, not a social arrangement dressed up as affection, but something more structurally intimate than either of them probably had with anyone else. Capote described it in terms that are almost embarrassingly direct, in the way that very honest people sometimes are when talking about something they can't quite contain. He said Babe was the most important person in his life, and he was the most important person in hers. He said they were like lovers, that she loved him and he loved her. He described her analyst apparently informing her that she loved Truman more than anyone else, more than Bill or her own children. In his notebook, he wrote a line that has been attributed to him across dozens of subsequent sources. The joke has 2 layers. She had only one fault, he wrote. She was perfect. Otherwise, she was perfect. The first read of that lands as simple adoration. The second read, the otherwise she was perfect, lands as a recognition that the perfection itself was the fault, that he saw it, that he knew what it was costing her. He sent her lilies of the valley when he sensed she was feeling low, without a note, just the flowers appearing without explanation, the act itself being the message. She told him, at some point, that she wanted to be buried beside him. There were specifics she gave him that she gave no one else. She told him that she and Bill had not had intimate relations for years, eventually for a decade. She told him about the brief affairs she'd had and ended out of fear. She told him the specific, humiliating story about the bedsheet, her husband's affair, the evidence she had been living with privately while publicly maintaining the fiction of a perfect marriage. This was the interior life she had maintained behind the performance for 20 years. Not serene, not composed, not the perfect wife of a great man. Frightened, lonely, managing, keeping everything together with the discipline she'd been trained into since childhood. She handed all of it to Truman Capote. Picture what that actually was. A woman who had spent her entire adult life performing composure, sitting with someone in whom she could be entirely, specifically, unglamorously honest. The relief of that. The particular warmth of being known by someone who already knew the performance and preferred the person underneath it. After decades of the gold notebook and the suppressed feelings and the affairs she was too afraid to pursue, and the husband who demanded everything and returned very little, she had one relationship in her life that cost her nothing to maintain except honesty. It's worth sitting with that, because it's the precise thing that makes what happened next so annihilating. The most important thing to know about Truman Capote in 1966 is that he signed a contract with Random House to deliver answered prayers by 1968. He described the book, in interviews across those years, in terms that would be impossible to walk back. His magnum opus, a work in the tradition of Proust, the greatest novel of the age. He had been collecting material for it for 20 years. The material was everything his swans had ever told him in confidence. Every affair, every humiliation, every private disclosure made across 20 years of lunches and weekends and late-night phone calls where these women told him what they could tell no one else. He missed the 1968 deadline. He kept missing it. Through the early 1970s, answered prayers existed primarily as a conversational artifact, something Capote invoked in interviews as proof that serious work was happening behind the scenes of his glamorous social life. In June 1975, Esquire published Mojave, the first extract from the novel to appear in print. By one account, it landed with less of an impact than Capote anticipated. He decided the next chapter needed to be sharper. He reached into the reservoir of 20 years of confidence and pulled out what he had. The November 1975 issue of Esquire contained La Côte Basque, 1965. Imagine receiving it. You are Babe Paley, 60 years old, privately fighting lung cancer, living with the knowledge that your body has already begun the process of ending you. The magazine arrives. The story is framed as a lunch at the actual La Côte Basque restaurant on East 55th Street, told through the voice of a narrator sharing gossip with a woman named Lady Ina Coolberth, and the gossip is about the world Babe inhabits and has spent 30 years curating to perfection. The characters have thin fictional names. The events are real events. The people are real people. And anyone who had ever attended one of the Paley's dinners or spent a weekend on Long Island would recognize them within a paragraph. The story read like a guided tour through the private lives of everyone Babe knew and everything those people had told Capote in strict confidence, delivered over a long lunch to anyone in America with $3 and an Esquire subscription. The mechanics of social New York, the hierarchies, the resentments, the secret dependencies, dissected and displayed for a national readership with the precision of a naturalist pinning specimens. For Babe, one scene was all she needed. A media tycoon, the founder of CBS, recognizable to any reader who had read a newspaper in the previous decade, is depicted frantically attempting to scrub a stained bedsheet before his wife returns home. The stain is from a sexual encounter with another woman. The scene is grotesque in its specificity. The frantic scrubbing, the terror of discovery. The wife positioned as the naive party to be deceived and protected from the truth she was never meant to know. Babe had told Capote that story, in private, as the kind of disclosure you make only to the person you trust completely, the person who has no reason to weaponize it. The person who is safe. She had kept that specific humiliation locked away from every other person in her life, from friends, from family, from anyone who existed in the world where it might matter. She had given it to Truman Capote because she trusted him with it, because he was the one place where the performance wasn't required. He put it in a national magazine. The identity of the other woman in the scene has never been definitively established. Lawrence Lemur's biography of Capote points toward Marie Harriman. The FX dramatization Feud names Happy Rockefeller. Melanie Benjamin, who wrote the novel The Swans of Fifth Avenue, suggests Capote drew on multiple affairs and assembled a composite. What isn't contested, in any account, is whose affair it was and whose humiliation was being reproduced. The naive wife in the story was Babe. Her husband's serial infidelity, the thing she had contained and privatized and managed in silence for decades, was now the subject of an Esquire piece. Slim Keith, one of the other swans, used one word to describe her reaction to it: horrified. She said it to George Plimpton, who documented it. Anne Woodward, another woman depicted in the piece, had died by suicide shortly before publication. The issue ran anyway. The story didn't pause for any of this. For Babe, the specific texture of the humiliation wasn't generic public embarrassment. What happened was more precisely targeted than that. She had not simply been gossiped about in a glossy magazine. She had not merely been depicted unfavorably. What had happened was surgical. The one person she had trusted with the unvarnished truth had taken that truth, specifically the most humiliating truth, the one about the bedsheet, the one that showed her being deceived, the one that positioned her as the naive wife who didn't know, and served it to every cocktail party in Manhattan on a silver platter. The public performance of not knowing was the last genuine dignity she had left in her marriage. The pretense that everything was managed, contained, controlled, that Babe Paley was the impeccable wife of the impeccable CBS chairman, and their life together was as polished as their rooms. Capote had stripped that, too. Not just the secret, the performance of not having the secret, the last layer. She was also, at this precise moment, fighting for her life. Babe Paley had been diagnosed with lung cancer in 1974. She had smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day for years, a detail that, in retrospect, is almost unbearable in its ordinariness, the daily habit of an era that didn't yet fully understand what it was doing. By November 1975, when La Côte Basque 1965 hit newsstands, she had been living with a terminal diagnosis for approximately 12 months. Living, to be specific, inside the particular psychological geography of a person who knows their body has already made a decision that can't be reversed. Fighting it, certainly. Managing it with the same composed precision she brought to everything else. But knowing. Whether Capote knew the specifics of her diagnosis before he submitted the piece to Esquire isn't established in the historical record. The research is definitive on this gap. No source documents his knowledge of her cancer prior to publication. What is established is the timing. She was seriously ill with terminal lung cancer when he chose to publish what she had told him in confidence. The cruelty of the timing is arithmetically real, regardless of intent. A dying woman was publicly humiliated by her closest friend during the final years of her life. Whatever Capote knew or didn't know, the fact of it does not change. There is something psychologically precise and quietly devastating about where Babe directed her fury. Not primarily at her husband, the man who had actually had the affairs, the actual author of the behavior described in Capote's story, but at Capote. This isn't irrational. Bill's affairs were old information, long managed, the known structural reality of her marriage. The betrayal that was new, the violation that was fresh and specific and unforgivable, was Capote's. He was the man who was supposed to be the one safe place, the man whose value to her was specifically that he could be trusted with what no one else could know. He had not merely gossiped, he had weaponized love. There was, after that, nowhere left. There is no dramatic confrontation on the record, no documented phone call where she delivered a verdict, no letter, no meeting arranged through intermediaries that ended in shouting. What happened was simpler than that, and in its simplicity, far more absolute. She stopped existing in his world. The calls he made went unanswered. The letters found no reply. The friends sent to intercede returned with nothing. Babe Paley had made her decision, and she applied it with the same precision she had always brought to every other managed element of her life. Capote's attempts to restore the connection are described across multiple accounts as frantic. Phone calls, letters, pleas channeled through mutual friends. None of it moved her. Picture him at a telephone in some rented room or borrowed apartment. Because by 1975, the apartments and estates and yacht decks that had been available to him through the social world he had just incinerated were closing off one by one. Calling the St. Regis, calling the Long Island estate, being told politely by some member of the Paley household that Mrs. Paley was unavailable. Again. Still. The practiced politeness of very wealthy people who have decided you no longer exist is something particular. It doesn't slam the door. It simply becomes impossible to find the door. Slim Keith's movement was swift and documented. She dropped him. Britannica's description of the broader social aftermath is economical. He became a social pariah. C.Z. Guest, who had been left entirely out of the story, maintained some contact. Lee Radziwill, depicted in the piece in terms that weren't unflattering, kept in touch. The two women with the least to lose from continued association were the two who offered it. Everyone else, the women whose private lives had been displayed in print, the husbands whose affairs had been named, the friends of friends who recognized enough to be appalled, became unavailable to him in the particular way that very socially powerful people become unavailable to someone they have decided to excise. Not dramatically, simply. This mattered in a specific, structural way that goes beyond hurt feelings. Capote's social life had been the Swans. His access to Long Island estates, European yachts, private jets, exclusive dinners. The entire physical texture of the life he had been living since the mid-1950s had been routed through these friendships. Without them, he wasn't simply lonely. He was displaced from the ecosystem he had inhabited for 20 years. And more practically, the material for answered prayers had come from those dinners. The gossip that fed his literary ambitions had been drawn directly from those confidences, shared freely because the women trusted him. He had published the gossip and, in doing so, closed the tap permanently. He never finished the novel. His journals indicate the book had been conceived in 7 chapters. He apparently drafted only 4. 3 were published in Esquire in 1975 and 1976. The unfinished manuscript was published posthumously by Random House in 1986, a slim, incomplete thing bearing no resemblance to the magnum opus he had been promising for 20 years. Random House had been waiting for delivery since 1966. 20 years and a missed deadline and the ruins of every significant friendship he had. And what they published in the end was fragments. In 1978, Capote appeared on a television interview with Stanley Siegel, visibly impaired, confessing on air that he frequently mixed drugs and alcohol. It was a public unraveling documented in real time, in front of cameras, with no social architecture remaining to pull him aside. The women who might once have done that, who would have placed a quiet phone call or sent a car or simply appeared, were no longer speaking to him. His favorite swan, Babe Paley, died on July 6, 1978. She died in her New York City apartment. She was 63 years old. The New York Times ran her obituary the following morning under the headline, "Barbara Cushing Paley dies at 63, style pace-setter in 3 decades." She was buried at the Memorial Cemetery of St. John's Church in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. Truman Capote wasn't there. She had died before they could reconcile, according to multiple accounts. The reconciliation being one she had chosen, consistently and completely, not to pursue. Capote died on August 25, 1984, at age 59, from liver failure attributed to multiple drug intoxication. He died in Bel Air, California, in the home of Joanne Carson, the ex-wife of Johnny Carson. Answered Prayers had been announced in 1966 and was still waiting in 1984. It was published in 1986, 2 years after his death, the way you might finally deliver a letter that arrived too late to matter. What Babe Paley's story is ultimately about isn't the famous betrayal, though the betrayal is real and the details are specific enough to sustain this entire documentary on their own. What it's about is what happens when a woman builds her entire identity on being chosen correctly, and what there is to fall back on when the architecture collapses. She was chosen by her mother as a commodity to be placed advantageously in the world. She was chosen by Stanley Mortimer, who then fell apart. She was chosen by William Paley, who gave her everything material and withheld everything intimate. She was chosen by Truman Capote as his favorite among all the women he loved, and he used what she gave him to humiliate her in front of every person she had spent her life trying to impress. Carol Prezant, who worked for the Paleys as an au pair in 1957 and remembered the experience decades later with striking precision, described Babe as a pure construct of beauty and what was once called breeding, real and unreal, a person, and yet also a rendering. That phrase, a person and yet also a rendering, is the most accurate description available of the impossible position Babe occupied. She was simultaneously the woman and the performance of the woman, and for most of her adult life, those two things were so thoroughly fused that separating them would have required tearing something essential loose. Her daughter Amanda later described their relationship as virtually non-existent. She specified that the distance had been Babe's choice, not her own. A woman who had organized her entire existence around the curated performance of the perfect wife and perfect hostess had not had the emotional architecture left over to be a consistently present mother. The gold notebook full of perceived flaws, the decade without physical intimacy, the brief affair she had and then quietly ended out of fear. These aren't the details of a contented life. They are the details of a woman holding together an edifice she understood was her only available structure. Marietta Peabody Tree, who had known Babe since childhood, called her the most glamorous of her generation. The word glamorous contains, etymologically, something closer to enchantment, to spell, to the production of an illusion so convincing that the audience stops trying to see around it. The glamorous person is the one whose surface generates a distortion field. Babe Paley was glamorous in that oldest sense. She made the performance so complete that most people stopped asking what was underneath, because asking felt somehow unkind, like trying to see past the stage to the machinery behind it. Capote was the one person she let behind the stage. She told him about the decade without sex. She told him about the fear that kept her from continuing her own affairs. She told him about the bedsheet, the specific, humiliating, private story of her husband's infidelity that she had been carrying alone for years while publicly performing the fiction of a perfect marriage. She handed him the interior life she had never shown anyone else. He published it. What she did afterward is the part most worth understanding correctly, because there is a version of this story that romanticizes her silence as something beatific, a graceful withdrawal, a composed farewell, the last act of a woman who had always been above the fray. That version is probably wrong, or at least incomplete. She was, by the accounts available, horrified and heartbroken. She was a woman fighting terminal cancer who had simultaneously been publicly humiliated by the one person she had trusted with her real life. The silence wasn't the product of equanimity. It was the product of having been stripped of something irreplaceable and choosing, finally, not to pretend otherwise. But it was also, whatever its emotional origins, her one genuine act of unilateral sovereignty. For decades, she had been the object of other people's decisions. her mother's ambitions, her husband's demands, society's perpetual gaze, and ultimately, Capote's pen. She had been arranged, curated, chosen, and displayed. She had been trained to suppress her own feelings as a matter of reflex. She had managed her husband's behavior in the privacy of her own awareness, rather than speaking it aloud, because speaking it aloud wasn't the bargain, and wasn't the woman she had been built to be. When Capote published that story, he took the one thing she had managed to keep genuinely private, the interiority behind the performance, the real woman behind the rendering, and made it public. Her response was to exercise, for perhaps the first time at full scale, the only power she had always possessed and rarely used without apology. The power to decide who existed in her world. She decided Truman Capote didn't. She maintained that decision for 2 years and 8 months, through her own dying, through his attempts to re-enter her life, through the social machinery of mutual friends and intermediary pleas. She was 63 years old and fighting for her life, and she spent what remained of it without him in it. Not necessarily because she had stopped loving him. The evidence on that is genuinely ambiguous, and she left no record of what she felt. She had been trained not to. But she had decided. The New York Times called her a style pace-setter. The Tatler would describe her as the most beautiful woman of the 20th century. Truman Capote had written in his notebook that she had only one fault. She was perfect. Otherwise, she was perfect. All of those descriptions are tributes to the rendering, to the construct, the performance, the astonishing surface she maintained across 63 years of being watched. None of them get at what she knew and kept knowing in the gold notebook. She was born July 5, 1915. She died July 6, 1978. In between, she spent 63 years being the most admired woman in every room she entered. The one man she had ever truly let see past the admiration used what he found there to make her feel, in the end, exactly like the thing she had worked her entire life not to be. The naive wife. The woman who didn't know. The fool. Whether the silence she kept in those final years was dignity or devastation or both simultaneously, the evidence supports all 3 readings and resolves none of them cleanly. She left no record of the answer. She had been trained from childhood not to leave one. That, too, is part of the story. If you want more stories like this, women whose lives were more complicated than the image they perfected, and the people who failed to understand what they were destroying, subscribe. There are more of them.